All right, guys, let's get started. Today what we're going to be doing is doing a quick review of, or an overview of period 5 on the exam, which is 1844 to 1877. But if you want to think about it in terms of like dates and events and kind of link the two, um, what we're really looking at is like manifest destiny and the beginnings of westward expansion, sectionalism, the slavery and secession debate through the Civil War, and then to the end of Reconstruction. So we'll be looking a lot at really the basically events in the run up and the aftermath of the Civil War. You know, all of this is kind of grouped together this way. So let's get into it. Why don't we start with manifest destiny as a whole? So you know that like even going back to the colonial era, Americans had been looking to push west, right? And the definition of the West has changed over the years. You know, that's kind of one theme that's probably worth keeping in the back of your head, is that westward expansion has always been something that people have had or have put a priority on in the United States. But, you know, at first the West was over the Appalachians, and then the West was over the Mississippi. And then the West was to California. And as you guys probably remember from the beginning of this year, eventually once the continental United States was settled, the West kind of transformed into colonial expansion abroad, right? And the idea of creating an empire. So kind of keep that in mind. There's that constant push to acquire more land. But this is kind of the very beginning of it, at least in United States history as opposed to American colonial history. Because if you think about it, the push west since the American Revolution had been relatively easy for the United States. You know, when the Revolution ended, the Treaty of Paris gave the United States all the land in between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. And while there were Native American tribes there, and there were some conflicts with the British on the borders and the Spanish in Florida, you know, the overwhelming majority of that land had been given to the United States. So settlers pushed west and developed it with, in the grand scheme of things, not a tremendous amount of difficulty. And then, you know, during Jefferson's administration, before any of that land had ever really been settled, you know, by 1800, while people had started to move into the Ohio Territory and into like Alabama and Mississippi as territories, there was still plenty of land to go around. And even at that point, then Jefferson buys Louisiana, which, you know, doubles the size of the United States. And so now the United States has all this land out west that it can practically give away for free. So manifest destiny starts to become this idea of, well, the United States controls 2/3 of the North American landmass, push to the next third and really complete a Atlantic to Pacific coast country, right? And manifest destiny was rooted in a lot of things. It was rooted in nationalism in the United States. It had religious connections to it, right? There's the idea with manifest destiny that basically God had decided that the United States was destined to expand to the West. So it was not just a patriotic duty, but in some ways almost like your Christian duty to move west and civilize. And then there were some other ideas that kind of tied in with this too. There was a thought that by pushing west, you could expand like American-style democracy. In the South, obviously, there were some slavery motives involved with this. So, you know, it was kind of a mixture of things. But the one thing that really, regardless of whether the settlers were Northern or Southern, or were, you know, wealthy kind of speculators or poor farmers, really everybody in the United States was pretty unified on the idea that at some point or another, the U.S. kind of landmass was going to push all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So when we get into the 1840s and 50s, this is where kind of like the definitions about what that Western land should look like start to kind of be debated. And then also we start to see some of these wars of expansion come into play, particularly with like the Mexican-American War. So really, when we start with the Mexican-American War, we got to kind of rewind and look at Texas a little bit, right? And kind of how Texas came to be an independent nation. So you know that Texas was originally founded by basically American settlers moving into Mexico. You know that Mexico controlled Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Utah, Colorado. You know, basically all the land west of the Louisiana Purchase. Um, and so Mexico didn't have nearly the population the United States had, nor did it have like the immigration pull that the United States had. So all throughout the 1830s, the Mexican government encouraged American settlers to move. And by the 1830s, Americans, particularly like slave-owning planters, actually outnumbered Mexican citizens in the province of Texas. And what this does is this starts to prompt clashes because, you know, in some ways Texas mirrors the United States with Great Britain. Texans didn't want to pay taxes to the Mexican government. Texans didn't really want to listen to it. You know, the Mexican government didn't necessarily want them bringing slaves in, and they did anyway. And so when the Mexican government tries to clamp down with Santa Anna, that's when Texas, you know, revolts and starts the Texas War of Independence. Now, we don't have to really go into depth with that because I don't think they're going to ask you about that, quite frankly, especially given the format this year. But you know that ultimately the Texans gain independence, and they ask the United States to annex it, and the United States actually rejects it initially, right? So Texas is an independent nation for about a decade, and then in 1844, with President Tyler, who is a pro-slavery expansionist, Texas applies for statehood again. And it's granted it in 1845. Texas becomes part of the United States, and that's what's going to kind of precipitate the Mexican-American War. So at the same time, you know, we'll get to the war in a second. You also see in the north the boundary between the United States and, at the time, what was, you know, British Canada, but what today is obviously just Canada. The border there being settled on too. So you know the Northwest Territory of Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and then on the Canadian side, British Columbia. This was all kind of disputed. You know, the United States and Great Britain both claimed the land. Neither side was willing to budge. And by the time you get to the middle of the 1800s, it starts to look not necessarily like there's going to be an open war. I think sometimes history books kind of, you know, make it seem like it was a lot closer to war than it was. But you do get that famous 54-40 or fight slogan about the territory and how far north or south the British or American claims were going to go. And ultimately under President Polk in 1846, the British and the Americans signed a deal to create the modern border between like Oregon, Washington, Idaho, a little bit of Montana, and the border of Canada. And a lot of this was just kind of due to circumstance. There were a lot more American settlers out west than British settlers. The United States military was never going to be able to beat the British military in a long war. But on the flip side, the British weren't going to be able to hold all of that land either because they just didn't have the population there. So think of the settlement and the Oregon Treaty as kind of being recognition on both sides that, like, look, we don't want to fight, and it just makes sense to split this. What that also does, though, is that by 1846, you have this treaty signed, and now that allows the United States to turn its focus to the South and Mexico and the Mexican-American War, and there's a lot of pressure for this war in the United States. By basically 1840 to 1860, you have about 300,000 Americans moving west, which is a lot of people at that time. The Mexican population was really not in this part of the country of their country at the time. That's why they were turned into Americans for settlement, for economic development. And when Polk gets elected in 1844, he actually got elected on, I won't go as far as to say it was a pro-war policy, but it was pretty close. He basically ran on the platform of Manifest Destiny. And within that platform, he said, I'm going to annex Texas, which we know he does. and I'm going to like take the land all the way through to California if necessary. So once Texas is annexed, that leads to a severing of diplomatic relations with Mexico, and ultimately the war that we know results in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. We won't go into the military part again. I don't think that's necessarily an issue, especially for this year's exam. But this is what leads to the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically gives the United States its entire western third in exchange for about $15 million, which is, we've talked about this before. A lot of times treaties will give a little bit of money to the losing side, and really that's more of a way to just kind of keep the government stable. So Mexico loses, about half of its territory, and in the process, the United States picks up basically its western third. And then in 1853, the United States purchases a little bit more land from Mexico as opposed to in a war, known as the Gadsden Purchase, which is basically the southern chunk of Arizona and New Mexico. And that becomes the final boundary of the 48 states. That's the official boundary of the lower 48 states in the U.S. So what this does, though, is in a lot of ways this creates not a problem, but at the very least a major question, which is, well, now what do we do? Because all of those agreements like the Missouri Compromise and all the questions about things like slavery kind of get blown up, because now there's all this land out there and people are rushing to settle it, and none of them are states yet. It's all territories, so each state gets to write its own constitution. So there are these questions about what are these states going to look like? And obviously, there were a lot of people who wanted slave states, and there were a growing number of people who wanted to abolish slavery throughout the U.S. So this is, in a lot of ways, the kind of central issue about sectionalism. So that debate about slavery starts almost immediately after the end of the Mexican-American War. It is triggered by a combination of things. The California Gold Rush is a big part of it, which we'll get to in a minute. But the first really major issue is what's called the Wilmot Proviso. It's named after a congressman. When the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, remember that goes through Congress, an anti-slavery congressman puts this proviso in, which says slavery will be banned in all of the new territory. And the South freaks out. They hit the roof because they see this as a move by abolitionists to check their power and to get rid of slavery permanently in the United States. It gets shot down, but it does ultimately lead to this major crisis that eventually becomes known as the Compromise of 1850. So the Compromise of 1850 starts to become a necessity because on top of the Wilmot Proviso, a lot of this territory starts to apply for statehood much quicker than normal. California being the big one because of the gold rush. California had less than 20,000 people in it. And when gold was discovered 4 years later, it had 220,000 people in it. So the population literally expanded 1,000% in 4 years. That is, generally speaking, unheard of. So California wants to be a state. And Southerners don't want California to join because the South sees it as being a free state and threatening them politically. And the North wants it to join because obviously it's going to be a state with a big population. It's a free state. This debate gets so heated that you start to see some open discussion in the South about secession. And remember, this is 1850. So we are, still 10 years off from the Civil War. So what happens? In 1850, Henry Clay steps in and will mastermind this compromise that's now known as the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1850, excuse me. So what he does is he pitches this idea. And the terms of the Compromise of 1850 were California would be admitted as a free state. Any new states after California that come from the territory taken by Mexico get what is called popular sovereignty. And remember, that means that any new state in the Mexican territory gets to choose whether it wants to be a free state or a slave state. Washington, D.C. Will keep slavery. However, they will ban the slave trade in the capital itself. And the North would agree to better fugitive slave laws, basically. Clay is challenged by our buddy John C. Calhoun, who proposes a better deal for the South and a worse deal for the North. Northerners reject that, and the whole thing gets shot down. However, fortunately, it gets saved by kind of some newer senators who will eventually become some of the leaders of the country. Jefferson Davis, Stephen Douglas, William Seward. We should know all those names. This is when they're young senators just kind of starting out in the American government. What they do is they propose to create basically like a mechanism where you can pass all of the Compromise of 1850, but do it in a way where it'll get enough votes. So here's the problem. Clay proposed the Compromise of 1850 and those 4 points that I talked about and said we're going to vote on them all at once. So the problem is you couldn't get enough people to vote then because no Northerner is going to vote for better fugitive slave laws. No Southerner is going to vote for California to be admitted as a free state. However, if you broke it up and voted on each proposal one at a time in succession, you could get enough people to vote for each one where all 4 would pass. And then they could go home and say to their constituents, look, I didn't vote for the stuff that we don't want. So no Northerner would have to say, yeah, I voted to improve fugitive slave laws. Or no Southerner would have to go, yeah, I voted to allow California in as a free state without another slave state. So they broke it up, and they did that piecemeal. And in addition, Stephen Douglas cut a deal with some of the Southern politicians to ensure that a railroad, a Transcontinental Railroad, would get built in the South as well. And when you put all that together, they were able to get the compromise passed. Unfortunately, that compromise is very, very short-lived. You guys know this. There's another compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. So obviously something happened in between. But at least in 1850, it looks like the crisis has been averted. So let's start to kind of work forward. Almost immediately, the Compromise of 1850 begins to experience problems. The Whig Party starts to fall apart. You start to see the growth of the Free Soilers, which are abolitionists, right? Or at least partial abolitionists, I should say. In addition to that, we begin to see northern states blatantly ignore the new fugitive slave rule. So a lot of Southerners feel like they were getting ripped off by this deal. Kind of going farther, you start to see some calls for expansion into other parts of the world with slavery. I think the most famous would be the Ostend Manifesto, where Southerners started to propose invading Cuba and taking it over as a slave state, right? So all these things start to come together and really whip up the pro-slavery, anti-slavery debate and sectionalist tensions. And as more and more people push west, this comes to a head in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So in 1854, there is a proposal to build a new Transcontinental Railroad. Ultimately, it is the first Transcontinental Railroad that we talked about right at the beginning of the year. So this is like when it's in the planning stages before the Civil War. And when the proposal is made, it's made by Stephen Douglas. Remember, he's from Illinois. He wants the railroad to go through Chicago because it'll make money for his state. So he proposes organizing the Nebraska Territory. All right. Now remember, that territory included Kansas and Nebraska at the time. So he wanted to organize it, get them into states, so that he could basically run his railroad into Illinois and into Chicago. But he knew he was going to get problems from the Southerners. So he cuts a backroom deal. And what he says is, or what he gets is written into the law. And he got enough Northerners to approve of it who wanted the railroad in their states, and he got the Southerners to approve of it because of slavery, which we'll talk about in a second. That's why this is able to happen. Is he says, I will allow Kansas and Nebraska to be opened up to popular sovereignty, and they can choose if they want to be free or slave states. Now, both of those are very, very far north of the Missouri Compromise line. So it was seen as nullifying the Missouri Compromise. That gets shot down. But ultimately, what they do agree to is Kansas gets to be a slave state and Nebraska a free state. Assuming that the state constitutions agree to it. And what this sparks is kind of this mini civil war known as Bleeding Kansas, because a lot of Northerners feel betrayed by Douglas and by the fact that slavery is now getting much farther north than it was ever supposed to go. The Whig Party will actually completely collapse, and in response to the Whig collapse and the ability to move slaves north of the Missouri Compromise line, the Republican Party will form basically overnight. And that will become the anti-slavery Free Soil Party that opposes the Democrats. Now, what this all leads to is, as I said before, this kind of mini civil war in Kansas where pro and anti-slavery factions will rush into the state to try to gain control of it. And for a couple of years, it doesn't really settle down until the Civil War starts. For a couple of years, you have open fighting between pro and anti-slavery advocates in Kansas over who's going to control the state and whether or not slaves will be allowed. This is where John Brown kind of becomes real famous. This is the source of the fight between Brooks and Sumner. The infamous beating up of Sumner in Congress. And this is really where we start to reach the point of no return when it comes to the Civil War, because the pro-slavery faction says that basically we cannot get rid of slavery. It is the foundation of Southern life. It's good for the South. The pro-slavery faction, believe it or not, as terrible as this sounds, actually argued it was good for the slaves. The argument they made was that slaves in the South were treated better than factory workers in the North. The one thing with that, which is kind of horrible too, I mean, there's no good stuff about this, is as terrible as that sounds, in a physical condition sense, not obviously a freedom sense, there is actually a fair amount of evidence to suggest that slaves were treated better than factory workers in northern place cities. Again, just in a physical condition sense. But even that should tell you something about how bad the factories were, because we know how bad treatment of slaves was. So Southerners used this as an excuse, basically. The Free Soilers were kind of a mixed bag. Some of them rejected slavery on moral grounds. They said slavery is just, reprehensible morally. Others said they didn't like the idea that Southerners didn't have to pay for their labor sources. A lot of people saw it in the North, businessmen, as like Southerners basically cheating because they didn't have to pay anybody. But both groups agreed that they wanted slavery to at least not expand in the United States, and some of them went as far as to say they wanted it to be abolished as well. And unfortunately, we get this series of like incredibly weak leaders at this time. We had guys like Millard Fillmore, Tyler, Taylor. None of these guys are good presidents, but no one is worse at this point in history than James Buchanan. Because when Buchanan gets elected in 1856, he is maybe the most indecisive person we had ever seen in the presidency. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 will split the country dramatically. If you recall, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court with Chief Justice Taney, who you should remember is Jackson's Secretary of Treasury. That's how he became Chief Justice. He did whatever Jackson wanted, so that was his reward. Taney basically says that the federal government can't take property away from people. Remember, Dred Scott was a slave in the North. He had been taken north by his master, and his master died, so he decided, so he sued the federal government basically for his freedom. Taney argued Dred Scott was property, so he wasn't even allowed to bring the case to court because he was not a person, he was property. He went one step farther and in the decision actually implied that even free African Americans in the United States should not have rights or citizenship. And then went as far as to say that states have a constitutional right to do whatever they want regarding slavery, and the federal government has no authority to regulate them. It is the most pro-slavery court decision in the history of the United States, and it basically brings us to the brink of civil war. And Buchanan does nothing. Buchanan does not stop bleeding Kansas. He just kind of lets it fight. And ultimately in 1860, when Lincoln gets elected, we know Lincoln is elected in this contested election where 4 different candidates run, and Lincoln does not win a plurality. He wins a majority rather. He wins a plurality. When Lincoln wins and the southern states begin to secede, Buchanan's response is, it's illegal for them to secede, it's unconstitutional, but I as president have no constitutional authority to stop them from seceding. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, that means that you get it. He basically dodged. He said, I can't do anything. And so when the South begins to secede and Lincoln is waiting to become president, remember, you didn't get inaugurated till March. From November to March, Buchanan does nothing and allows the South to basically set up and prepare to fight the Civil War. All right, so let's before we get into the Civil War, let's kind of backtrack just a little bit and talk about the rise of Lincoln. So you guys know that Lincoln was, other than Stephen Douglas, kind of the leader or the next kind of presumed leader coming out of the North. I mean, I know last year you guys talked about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which kind of brought Lincoln to national prominence. But there are some misconceptions about Lincoln too. Remember, he's anti-slavery, but he's not an abolitionist. All right, there's a difference. He doesn't agree with slavery. He doesn't want it to spread. But when he runs for president, is very upfront and says, I will not abolish slavery where it already exists. I want to check its expansion. And then his kind of philosophy or his belief was that because slavery was an institution that he didn't think was viable in the long run, that if you stopped its expansion, ultimately it would disappear in other places too, kind of like a withering on the vine. So as he gradually rose to become the front runner in the Republican Party, a lot of his strategy was kind of pitched on what sometimes is called like big tent politics. Try to draw on as many different interest groups as you can. So that kind of like more moderate version of being anti-slavery was a big draw. He was in favor of the Homestead Bill. He was pro-business. He was pro-railroad. He was a free soiler in terms of slavery, like we said. So all those things kind of led to this pretty broad Republican Party. Now, obviously, when he won, as I had said, it took a while because obviously the inauguration is until March. But what ultimately happens then is, the South will secede while Lincoln is basically like waiting to take office, and that becomes a pretty significant issue because now when Lincoln is inaugurated in March of 1861, really all of the Deep South had already seceded, and this puts him in this kind of, to say the least, precarious position. Because you are the new president, you've just been inaugurated, you only got votes in the North, half of what became the Confederacy had already seceded, and you still have all of these federal troops in the South, most famously at Fort Sumter. So Lincoln comes up with this policy to basically not start a war, but not back down from the South, kind of hoping in the long run that maybe the South would be provoked into attacking. If the South attacks Northern or Union troops, Lincoln's got a lot more leeway than if he invades the South preemptively. So what Lincoln does is Fort Sumter kind of becomes the place where this is put to the test. And what Lincoln basically says is he says, hey, I'm going to send resupply to the troops in Fort Sumter. And there's not going to be any weapons. It's just going to be food, clothing. He kind of sticks them in this spot where the South basically would be attacking an unarmed convoy if they stopped it. And if they don't stop it, Lincoln exerts federal influence in the Confederacy. And if they do stop it, then it gives him the ability to go and invade the South, because then they started it. And the South makes the decision to attack Fort Sumter. At that point, the northern half of the Confederacy secedes. And then the border states, really because of very swift action on Lincoln's part and on the federal government's part, remain. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland were all on the verge of potentially seceding. Remember, those are slave states. But they stayed in the Union. And that was a game changer in a lot of ways, because that would have completely changed the strategy in the war if those had been Confederate states. All right, so we won't go through a lot of the combat stuff because that's not really part of this test. But generally speaking, the Union had a lot more advantages than the South. The North had literally 4 times the non-slave population as the South, so they had the manpower for the army. Almost the entire industrial capacity of the United States was located in Union states as opposed to Confederate states. Most of the railroads, turnpikes, canals were in the North. The ability of the South to fight a prolonged war was something that was really not in the cards. The Confederacy, for their part, kind of had some of the same advantages that the revolutionaries had in the American Revolution. For the Confederacy to exist, they just had to not lose all their troops, basically. Like the Confederacy existed as long as they were still fighting in some form. So for the Confederacy, the strategy was hold out, hope that at some point the Europeans would back them. They were hoping that the cotton exports would draw France and Britain in on the side of the Confederacy. Again, it's kind of an interesting parallel to the colonies in the Revolution, and basically hold off the Union as long as they could, or if they could win some sort of like real quick victory, by knocking out the Union Army or capturing Washington, D.C. always came up as their kind of thing. That would help as well. But generally speaking, the longer the war went on, the more likely the Union was to win. And the Union also, as the war broke out, took a lot of steps to kind of improve its chances to win, at least in the long run. The federal government clamped down very quickly, much faster than the Confederacy's government did. Lincoln suppressed Democrats who were sympathizers with the Confederacy. He suspended habeas corpus. He instilled martial law anywhere where it looked like people were going to be resistant or potentially sympathize with the South. He even went as far as to actually jail some Confederate sympathizer politicians. And then denied the Supreme Court, or I should say, ignored the Supreme Court when the court ordered him to release them. Now, granted, these are all things that are, at best, questionable in terms of constitutional authority, and at worst, blatant violations of the Constitution. But Lincoln's strategy, or his approach, basically was, look, the country's split in half. This is a very different type of conflict. And if you remember, he never recognized the South. It was never seen as an independent country. He treated it as, in a legal sense, as if there was basically a mob that took over half the country. And that's why he was able to get away with martial law, was he kind of, again, in a legal sense, equated it almost to like rioting. Obviously that's only a name, but what that does is that gives him some authority that he wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. You also see the South, on its part, really struggle in a lot of ways. While initially they had some battlefield successes, the South took the approach. Remember, slavery in the South was argued as like a states' rights thing. So the South took the approach of having a very weak centralized government at first. Again, a kind of interesting parallel. They kind of mirrored the Articles of Confederation government in some ways. The Confederacy's federal government didn't have the right to tax. Initially, they didn't even draft soldiers. They just waited for enlistments. They had shortages all the time because they couldn't organize trade. And then eventually, ironically, the South actually became more dictatorial than the North did, basically in the interest of trying to save the country. The war basically goes in some people divide it into 3 phases, others divide it into 2. In short, the South wins most of the battles in the first phase. In the second phase of the war, when the South attempts to invade the North at both Antietam and Gettysburg, the war is kind of like in the balance. And then anytime we look at anything post-Gettysburg and Vicksburg, it's all downhill for the Confederacy. And it starts to become, just a question of when the Confederacy is going to be defeated. But really the biggest thing to take out of this is the Confederacy's failure, not necessarily on the battlefield, but the consistent failure to gain any sort of support in Europe. And as the Union mobilized, got more troops, became even better supplied, ultimately it was able to overwhelm the South. And we know this culminates in the final year of the war with Sherman basically burning the entire state of Georgia to the ground. Lincoln obviously getting reelected in 1864. And by 1865, the South ultimately having to surrender when Robert E. Lee is surrounded at Appomattox by Grant, right? We also know, really, in the bigger sense, beyond the combat, the big development right at the tail end of the Civil War is finally the passage of the 13th Amendment. And that became really crucial because as part of the Reconstruction, which we'll get to after, as part of the Reconstruction efforts, all of those southern states that had seceded had to acknowledge the 13th and then later on the 14th and 15th Amendments as well, which we'll talk about. All right, so let's start getting into some of the basic things about the beginnings of Reconstruction. So in a physical sense, the South had been completely devastated by the war. Lots of cities had been destroyed. Most plantations had been destroyed. Most people were bankrupt, not just the wealthy. You had millions of now free slaves who had nowhere to go with no help. You had actually a pretty high death toll. I mean, we know that the Civil War was costly, but proportionally, we don't always talk about it as much. 1 in 5 free men in the South, so essentially 1 out of every 5 of the white male population in the South died, which has an impact on not just leadership, because obviously if they're Confederate leaders, you go, well, you don't want them in government anyway, but you also have to think of it as like 1/5 of really the working population, the free working population in the South is killed too. So, a lot of these poor whites who weren't slave owners were the ones who got killed. So it disrupts the economy as well. In addition to this, not only do you have to deal with the economic consequences for the freedmen, for the freed slaves, but you also have to figure out how to help them get back on their feet. So we have all of these massive, massive problems. In some ways, it's more complex than the problems after the Revolution or World War II for sure. So how do you deal with this, right? And to make things more complex, in the North, there was a lot of disagreement about what were you going to do with the freed slaves. Obviously, they'd been emancipated, but there was actually a debate in the North about like what citizenship would look like. This is something else we sometimes forget about, is that not everybody was an abolitionist, and also not all the abolitionists believed in total equality. So that created inaction too. And what you saw was that a lot of this inaction is also compounded by the assassination of Lincoln. Lincoln had proposed a fairly moderate plan. It was kind of a blend of the moderates, or of the conservatives and the radicals. His plan sometimes is known as presidential reconstruction. Sometimes it's known as the 10% plan. Basically, what he wanted to do was grant full amnesty to anybody who wasn't a high-ranking government official, planter, or like general. So like the average Southerner would get amnesty. And all they had to do was pledge loyalty to the Union and accept the abolition of slavery. And only 10% of each state had to actually formally do that, and then they could be readmitted. So Lincoln wanted to get the country back together basically as quickly as possible. Radical Republicans were completely against this. They thought that he was being far too soft on the South. Conservatives were a little more open to it. And before the war was even over, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana, which had been fully occupied by the Union, were already back in the Union. So even before the war was over, 3 of the former Confederate states had already been readmitted. The Radicals had a much more aggressive plan. They passed what was called the Wade-Davis bill, which Lincoln actually pocket vetoed to try to stop it. And what that did was it basically said not only did you have to have a governor appointed by the president, so a pro-union governor for the Confederate States, you had to swear that you had never actually aided the Confederacy, and if you had aided the Confederacy, you would never be granted full citizenship again. It would abolish slavery. It would force the Confederacy to pay off war debts, think like the Civil War version of reparations. Very, very aggressive. Radical Republicans really wanted to completely transform the South, which, in hindsight, you go, well, that maybe we should have done that instead, and it would have improved things. But at least in the short term, that would have caused tremendous upheaval and probably have led to some sort of insurrection in the South. Resistance to the Union winning, even more so than what we saw with groups like the Klan. And all of this really kind of falls apart. Lincoln was able to keep the radicals at bay because he was such a popular president at the end of the war, even though he was not popular in the beginning. And when Lincoln gets killed, and Andrew Johnson, who is like maybe the worst person ever for the job, especially in 1865. Remember, he's a pro-slavery Southerner who just didn't believe in secession. So he had been Lincoln's vice president as kind of a compromise. Remember, in 1864, Lincoln thought he was going to lose the election. So he got a border state, basically Northern Democrat, to be his vice president as a way to try to, garner support. He didn't need to in the end, and it has these terrible consequences because Andrew Johnson doesn't really have a cohesive plan. Johnson's mad because Southerners hate him. They looked at him as like a traitor, a turncoat. But he also wants to preserve the Southern way of life. He just wants to punish the individual elites. So Johnson's plan made almost no sense. He wanted basically the extremely wealthy to personally try to basically apologize and ask for pardon from him, and then he would have the discretion to do it. He was very catty about it. Like in particular, he refused to give Robert E. Lee a pardon, but he would give other people a pardon. It was just because he didn't like Robert E. Lee. There's all these kind of things that basically are personal vendettas. He said that they had to abolish slavery, but then he also did nothing to protect the freedmen and had no problem with limiting the civil rights of freedmen in the former Confederate states. So, unfortunately for the Union, Johnson's kind of personal disputes and his attitudes about Reconstruction, his lack of resolve to actually help the freedmen, it really destroys a lot of the chances for Reconstruction because he'll fight with the radical Republicans. And in those really crucial years of 1865 to 66, until he is ultimately voted out of office in 1868, but 65, 66, and also, obviously the last 2 years too, Johnson will fight with radical Republicans, and really most of the time the government is fighting, kind of these internal disputes rather than actually taking care of what needs to be done. So one of the things that really sparked the clashes with the radical Republicans, maybe the most important one, is Johnson's not only lack of aid to the freedmen, but his, almost like active attempt to suppress them. Black codes had been established, which are kind of the precursor to a lot of the Jim Crow laws, and these were all over the Confederacy. The North responds by passing the 14th Amendment or ratifying the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship for all Americans. And later on, the 15th Amendment is also ratified, guaranteeing voting rights. These are required for readmission. And what you see is that the Reconstruction process hits a reset because of this. Starting in 1866 and into 1867, the Congress will send Grant and the military down and divide the South into military districts and occupy the South against Johnson's wishes. And this leads to the Impeachment Showdown with the Tenure of Office Act. Just kind of briefly, if you recall, Johnson wanted to fire Grant, but the president can't fire generals. The president needs the Secretary of War to do it. The Secretary of War was a radical Republican, so he wouldn't do it either. So Johnson tried to fire the Secretary of War as well. And the radical Republicans kind of laid a trap for him. They passed the Tenure of Office Act, which basically said that the president couldn't fire his cabinet without congressional approval or Senate approval. That's unconstitutional today. That would never fly now. However, what we do see is basically the impeachment trial comes down to a final vote where moderate Republicans say, look, he's almost out of office. We shouldn't be removing a president for political disputes. And while he survives impeachment, Johnson very clearly is not going to become president in 1868, and that will usher in Grant. All throughout this time, too, you're starting to see a tremendous amount of cultural tensions, particularly in the South. You have black voters. You have carpetbaggers from the North. You have scalawags, which are Northern Republicans coming south, all running the Reconstruction governments. And these lead to resistance from like the Southern white population. There are assassinations, the Klan forms. Most of the efforts are met with violence, but the Union military is able to make a lot of it survive, at least for some time. The Freedmen's Bureau is established in an attempt to divvy up abandoned plantations to give to former slaves. That never happens, though. And what you see is a lot of former slaves start to fall prey to the crop lien system and sharecropping and tenant farming, where they basically kind of become de facto slaves, where they are bound to the land because they can never pay off their debts. And what you see is a lot of plantation owners start to create what look a lot like plantations after the Civil War. So briefly, Grant was in a position to help with this because Grant's kind of like a George Washington-esque character at the end of the Civil War, especially with the death of Lincoln. And there was a hope, and this is where we kind of get into some of the history that we talked about at the beginning of our school year this year. There was a real hope that Grant would be able to hold the country together because of who he was. But unfortunately, we know Grant was not really a good politician. So his presidency was really rife with scandal, credit mobilier scandal, the Panic of 1873. And as time goes on, more and more during Grant's administration, it becomes apparent that he's not going to be able to really maintain his grip. And what's going to happen is this is going to culminate with the Compromise of 1877. So if you remember, in 1877, or 1876, I should say, Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden ran against each other. Hayes was the Republican. And you had contested elections in several states with questionable votes. And basically what happened was the Democrats, because they narrowly lost, refused to acknowledge the election. In all fairness, there was a lot of corruption, and I think that there was some question about whether Hayes had won the election. Remember, Tilden is a Democrat from New York. He's not like a Confederate. So this becomes a problem because as you get closer and closer to Inauguration Day, the electoral results have not been ratified. So no one knows who's the president. So what happens is this kind of deal with the devil in 1877, where the Republicans basically trade Hayes becoming the president for an end to Reconstruction. And in the Compromise of 1877, you get the following terms, where Hayes is the president, but he must appoint a Southerner to his cabinet. All federal jobs have to be in the South, have to be approved basically by Southerners. Federal troops have to leave. And ultimately also a lot of investment money has to go to help rebuild the South. But the biggest part of this is the end of Reconstruction, because at this point, when the troops leave, no one will protect the freedmen. And what this will ultimately set up is the establishment of the Jim Crow system, which we'll look at in the next section. Okay, so that's good. That's a pretty good overview to start. We'll get into more of like the Jim Crow era in next unit, in Unit 6. But that's good. So you'll review this. You'll review your notes. You'll take your Unit 5 Period 5 AP practice tests, and we'll be ready to go. So I will talk to you soon. And yeah, that's that.